the day Pauline Shepard buried her husband, the sky above Cutter's Creek, Texas was the most beautiful shade of blue she had ever seen, and she hated it for that. It was the autumn of 1878, and the land was dry and golden and indifferent to human suffering in the way only the West Texas plains could be. Elias Shepard had been 34 years old, broad-shouldered and full of laughter, the kind of man who whistled while he worked and remembered the names of every horse he had ever ridden. He had been thrown from his mare during a cattle drive 3 miles north of town, and by the time they carried him home on a flat board, the light had already gone out of his eyes. The doctor said it was his neck, said it was quick. Pauline did not find comfort in that, though everyone who came to the burial seemed to think she should. She was 31 at the time, brown-haired and steady-eyed, a woman who had been raised in Missouri and brought west by love. She had a daughter named Clara, who was 7 years old and had her father's exact shade of dark eyes, and a homestead of 60 acres that Elias had spent 4 years breaking and building with his own 2 hands. Pauline knew cattle. She knew the land. She had worked beside her husband since the first year of their marriage without complaint or hesitation, and when the men of Cutter's Creek came to offer their help in those first weeks after the funeral, she thanked them and turned most of it down, because she knew the difference between genuine neighborliness and pity dressed up in a hat. She managed. That was the word people used when they talked about her. Pauline Shepard manages. They said it with a kind of breathless admiration that she found exhausting, because managing was not the same thing as living, and she knew the difference even if they did not. The grief was not loud. That was the thing about it. She had expected it to be loud. She had seen other women weep openly at gravesides and wear their sorrow like a garment they could not remove, and she had always assumed that was simply what grief looked like. But hers settled in quietly, the way dust settles after a wind, and coated everything she touched. She still made biscuits every morning. She still mended fences and checked on the cattle and braided Clara's hair and answered when neighbors called. She still laughed, sometimes genuine laughter, even, and people took that as a sign that she was healing. They did not know that the laughter sat alongside something hollow and permanent in her chest that she had simply learned to work around, the way you learn to favor a leg that no longer bends quite right. 2 years passed in this manner. The town of Cutter's Creek had grown some in those 2 years. A new telegraph office had gone up along the main road in 1879, and the railroad spur that everyone had been arguing about for a decade had finally been graded and laid, which brought new commerce and a rotating cast of strangers through the town with more regularity than anyone had been accustomed to. There was talk of a proper school being built, which pleased Pauline, because Clara was now 9 and bright as a new penny, and currently being taught to read by a rotation of mothers who passed a single copy of McGuffey's Reader between their households like a sacred text. It was in October of 1880 that Marcus Hadley arrived in Cutter's Creek. He came on the eastbound morning train with a single leather bag and a horse he had shipped in a stock car, a big roan gelding with a white blaze down his face that he called Brigadier. He was 36 years old, with dark hair that had gone silver at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red rock as the canyon country, and eyes the color of a cloudy river, not quite blue, not quite gray, something between the two that changed depending on what the light was doing. He wore his clothes like a man who had learned that comfort mattered more than appearance, which was to say simply and without vanity, with a good canvas coat over a collarless shirt and boots that had been resoled twice. He was not a particularly remarkable-looking man, not by any measure that announced itself loudly. But there was something about the way he moved, unhurried and deliberate, like a man who had learned to think before every step, that caused people to look at him a second time even when they could not explain why. He had come to Cutter's Creek because his younger brother, a rancher named Daniel Hadley, had a spread about 4 miles east of town and had been after Marcus for 2 years to come and work with him. Daniel Hadley had the land and the cattle but not enough hands, and Marcus had spent the better part of a decade drifting between ranching work in Colorado and New Mexico, and a brief, unhappy stint as a deputy marshal in a small town in the New Mexico territory that had cured him entirely of any romantic notions about law enforcement. He had seen enough of the West's hardness by then. He had buried people he cared about. He was tired in the particular way that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with having wanted things that did not materialize. And when Daniel's letters kept arriving with their reasonable arguments and their descriptions of good grass and clean water, Marcus had finally decided that putting down something like roots might be worth trying. He arrived at Daniel's ranch that first afternoon, and Daniel's wife, a tall, cheerful woman named Ruth, fed him a meal large enough to embarrass 3 men, and his nephew Thomas, Daniel's boy, who was 11 and serious in the manner of children who have been asked to grow up quickly, showed him around the property with the gravity of a real estate agent. Marcus liked all of it. He liked the quiet of it. He unsaddled Brigadier himself and brushed him down in the barn while Daniel leaned against a post and talked, and Marcus listened, and the evening came over the plains soft and orange, and for the first time in a long time he felt something that might have been peace settling across his shoulders. He met Pauline Shepard 10 days after his arrival, at the Cutter's Creek General Store, owned by a man named Fletcher Voss, who sold everything from flour to horseshoe nails, and kept a ledger of credit accounts for most of the farming families within a 20-mile radius. Pauline was at the counter with Clara beside her, and she was in the middle of a quiet but firm disagreement with Fletcher Voss about the price of lamp oil, which had gone up 3 cents per gallon since the previous month. Fletcher Voss was a round man with a red face and the slightly startled expression of someone who had been interrupted mid-sentence for his entire adult life. He was explaining with diminishing confidence that the supplier in San Antonio had raised his rates, and Pauline was listening to this explanation with a patience that was itself a form of pressure, the way still water is also a weight. Marcus had come in for coffee and a tin of tobacco, and he stood near the door for a moment, taking in the scene without intending to, and the thing he noticed first was not that she was handsome, though she was, in a quiet, particular way, but that she was entirely unintimidated by the cost of lamp oil, by the store, by the man behind the counter who outweighed her by 100 pounds. She simply stood there with her shoulders straight and her eyes clear and her argument politely but completely intact, and Fletcher Voss eventually arrived at a figure that was 1 cent below the new price and presented it as a compromise, and Pauline accepted it with a nod and a thank you that was genuine rather than victorious. Marcus moved to the counter to make his own purchases, and Daniel, who had come with him and knew everyone in Cutter's Creek by name, made the introduction with the easy social fluency of a man who had spent years becoming part of a community. "Pauline," Daniel said, "this is my brother I've been telling everybody about. Marcus, fresh out of New Mexico." "Marcus, this is Pauline Shepard. She's got the homestead up past the Callaway Draw." Pauline turned, and Marcus saw her face properly for the first time. Brown eyes, steady and level, a few lines at the corners from squinting into western sun, a serious expression that was not unfriendly but was clearly, naturally guarded in the way that a person becomes guarded when life has asked hard things of them. "Mr. Hadley," she said. "Mrs. Shepard," he said. "That was a well-managed negotiation." She looked at him for a moment, measuring whether he was making fun of her. She concluded correctly that he was not. "Fletcher Voss is a reasonable man," she said. "He just needs a moment to remember that." Daniel laughed. Clara, who had been examining a jar of hard candy on the counter with the focused intensity of a child trying to will something into existence through pure concentration, looked up at Marcus with the frank assessment of childhood and said, "Your horse has a white stripe." "He does," Marcus agreed. "His name is Brigadier." "That's a long name," Clara said. "He's a long horse," Marcus told her. Clara considered this, appeared to find it satisfactory and returned her attention to the candy jar. Pauline allowed herself the smallest possible smile, quickly contained, and gathered her parcels from the counter. "Welcome to Cutter's Creek, Mr. Hadley," she said, and walked out with Clara's hand in hers. And that was the first time Marcus Hadley and Pauline Shepard were ever in the same room. He thought about her for the rest of the day. Not in any dramatic fashion. He was not the sort of man who was given to dramatic interior events. But she was there, a clear shape at the edge of his thinking, the way a word you've been searching for suddenly sits right on the tip of your tongue, present and not quite reachable. He asked Daniel about her that evening while they sat on the porch, and the autumn dark came down around them. Daniel told him the whole of it without editorial comment: Elia's death, the 2 years since, the way she had kept the homestead running, the quality of her character as recognized by pretty much everyone in Cutter's Creek. He said it all the way you talk about someone you respect, and when he was done, Marcus sat quietly for a moment and looked out at the dark. "She's had it hard," Marcus said. "She has," Daniel agreed. "But she doesn't want pity for it. You do well to remember that." Marcus nodded, and he did remember it. He put it away carefully, like a piece of information that might matter later, without knowing quite why he was certain it would. The town had its rhythms, and Marcus learned them gradually. There was a church on the east end of Main Street where services were held every Sunday, and where the social life of Cutter's Creek largely organized itself. There was a saloon called the Dusty Boot that was respectable enough for most people to acknowledge existed without embarrassment. There was Fletcher Voss's general store, and a blacksmith, and a livery stable run by an ancient man named Cobb, whose last name no one seemed to know or need, and a small post office that also served as the telegraph receiving station. The town was growing but not yet grown. It still had the self-consciousness of a place that was deciding what it wanted to be, still moving between raw settlement and actual civilization, which in 1880 in West Texas meant a place where the law was present but thin, and where people's goodness or badness still determined things more than any written code could. Marcus went to work on Daniel's ranch and found the labor satisfying in the physical, uncomplicated way that outdoor work can be satisfying. The problem and the solution both visible and immediate, unlike so many of the problems he had spent the last decade tangling with. He was good with cattle and good with horses, and good with the sort of practical repair that ranch life constantly demanded, and Daniel's admiration for having him there was genuine and freely expressed. He encountered Pauline again about 3 weeks after the general store meeting, at Sunday services. She sat 2 rows ahead of him with Clara beside her, and he watched the back of her head for the duration of the sermon, not in any way that he would have wanted anyone to notice, just observantly, the way you watch weather coming across flat country and try to read what it intends. She sang the hymns. She held Clara's hand. She stood and sat with the unhurried self-containment of a woman who had long ago made peace with her own company. After the service, people gathered in the yard outside the church in the way that Sunday always created a loose, pleasant occasion for community. Marcus ended up near Pauline by the gradual drift of small-town social gravity rather than by any deliberate navigation, and they spoke for about 10 minutes about nothing in particular: the quality of the autumn, the new school that was being discussed, the condition of the roads after a recent rain. It was entirely ordinary conversation, the kind that flows between strangers who share a geography and nothing else yet. But Marcus noticed 2 things during it. One was that Pauline Shepard was more precise in her speech than most people he encountered. She chose her words with a care that suggested she had thought about language and its uses, that she valued getting things right rather than approximately right. The other thing he noticed was that when she smiled, truly smiled, not the small controlled expression she rationed for public consumption, her entire face changed in a way that was startling, like a window being opened in a dark room. He did not push. He had enough self-knowledge to understand that pushing was wrong here, both in terms of what she was and what she had been through, and in terms of what was true and decent. He let the Sundays accumulate and let the chance encounters in town accumulate, and let whatever was happening between them happen at its own pace, which was very slow, and he found he was not impatient about it. There was a difficulty that arrived in November of that year, which was that the cattle ranching operation run by a man named Orrin Bliss, who spread lay to the north of Daniels, and who had a long-standing and well-documented habit of grazing his cattle on land that was not his, began to make incursions on the eastern boundary of Pauline's homestead. This was not unusual in the way of West Texas land disputes. It was, in fact, exactly the kind of thing that had led to bloodshed in other counties, and everyone in Cutter's Creek knew it. Pauline discovered it on a Tuesday morning when she rode her boundary line as she did every 2 weeks and found the evidence unmistakable. The grass grazed down, the ground churned by hooves, and one of her fence posts knocked clean out of the ground as though something had simply decided it was not there. She was angry with the steady, cold quality that is more dangerous than hot anger, and she rode to Orrin Bliss's ranch and told him so directly. And Orrin Bliss, who was a wide, sunburned man with small eyes and the casual arrogance of someone who had been getting away with things for long enough to believe he would always get away with them, told her that his cattle must have broken through by accident and he would look into it. This was not the first time he had said this. Pauline knew it would not be the last. She went to the county land office and confirmed her boundaries and had the papers in order and brought them back to Cutter's Creek. And when she mentioned the situation to Fletcher Voss during her next trip to the store, not complaining, merely stating facts, because the situation had grown serious enough to require people knowing about it. Marcus was there, buying nails, and he listened without intruding. Later that afternoon, as the sun was dropping toward the horizon and burning the clouds into copper and rose, Marcus rode out to Pauline's homestead. He had thought about it for several hours and decided that there was a difference between intruding and being a neighbor, and that the distinction mattered and that he was capable of maintaining it. Pauline was in the yard splitting wood when he arrived, and she looked up at him on Brigadier with an expression that was not unwelcoming, but was clearly waiting to understand what he was there for. "I heard about your boundary trouble with Bliss," Marcus said. "I have some experience with land disputes from my time in New Mexico. I wondered if I could look at your eastern fence line and tell you what I think." There was a pause while Pauline evaluated this. "You're not here to tell me how to handle my own land," she said. It was not a question. "No," he said. "I'm here to look at a fence and give you an opinion if you want one. You decide what to do with it." She considered him for another moment with those level brown eyes. Then she set the axe against the woodpile and said, "Stable your horse. I'll show you." They walked the eastern boundary in the long amber light of a late November afternoon, and Marcus looked at the fence and the ground and the pattern of the incursions, and he told her what he saw plainly and without condescension. He told her where the fence needed reinforcing. He told her that the pattern of the grazing suggested it was not accidental. He told her that in his experience, a formal complaint to the county sheriff combined with documented evidence tended to produce better outcomes than confrontation, because it created a paper record that men like Orrin Bliss could not easily talk their way around later. Pauline listened. She asked 2 or 3 precise, intelligent questions. Marcus answered them. And then they stood for a moment at the edge of her property in the cooling evening air, looking out at the land that she had kept running for 2 years alone, and the silence between them was comfortable in a way that surprised them both. "You're Daniel Hadley's brother," she said, not as something she had forgotten, but as something she was placing, fitting him into a context. "Yes, Daniel Hadley is a good man." "He is," Marcus agreed. "The best I know." She looked at the fence line. "I'll write to the sheriff tomorrow," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Hadley." "Marcus," he said, not insistently, just offering it. Another pause. Then Marcus, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and it sat in the air between them for a moment like something warm. He rode home in the dark with Brigadier picking his way along the familiar road, and the stars over the Texas plains were extraordinary, the way they get in autumn when the air is clean and cold. He thought about Pauline Shepard walking the boundary of her land, the way she moved over it, with a proprietary knowledge that went all the way down to her bones, the way she touched the fence post and could tell from the touch how long ago it had been knocked loose. He thought about the way she had listened to him, genuinely, without performing attentiveness, actually taking in what he said and sorting it and using it. He thought about the moment the silence had fallen between them, and how it had not been the awkward silence of two people who did not know what to say, but the easy silence of two people who did not need to say anything. He admitted to himself quietly on that dark road under all those stars, beginning to fall in love with Pauline Shepard. He held the admission carefully, the way you hold something breakable, aware of its weight and its consequence, and its ability to get away from you if you are not paying attention. December came, and with it, the cold that dropped off the Texas plains like something poured from a tremendous height. Marcus spent the month working cattle alongside Daniel and his hands, and on 3 separate occasions found himself in town at the same time as Pauline, and each time they talked a little longer than the time before. He met her at the school meeting that the community held in the church hall on a Friday evening, where everyone argued pleasantly about whether the new schoolhouse should be built on the east or west end of town, and he sat 2 seats away from her, and they exchanged looks during the more heated portions of the debate in the way that people do when they share an opinion and an amusement about the occasion. He helped her, with the assistance of Daniel and 2 of Daniel's ranch hands, rebuild the section of eastern fence that Orrin Bliss's cattle had compromised, and he did it on a clear Saturday in early December when the sky was hard and blue and the air smelled of coming cold. Clara was home that day, school being out for some occasion, and she watched the fence-building operation from atop the woodpile with tremendous seriousness, and occasionally offered opinions about whether a particular post was straight enough, which Marcus listened to with equal seriousness, and usually agreed with. "You're good with her," Pauline said to him during the midday break, when Clara had gone inside for a moment. They were standing near the barn with cups of coffee that she had brought out, and the steam from the cups rose white in the cold air. "She's easy to be good with," Marcus said. "She's a remarkable child." "She is," Pauline said, and the pride in it was quiet and profound, the way a person's pride in something they love the most always tends to be. "Has her father's eyes," Pauline added, and it was the first time she had mentioned Elias to Marcus, and she said it without obvious pain, not as if the pain was gone, but as if she had found a way to carry it that allowed her to speak around it. Marcus did not respond immediately. He looked out at the cleared winter pasture, and then he said, "It sounds like he was a good man." "He was," Pauline said. "He was one of the best." "I'm glad she has his eyes then," Marcus said. "Something worth keeping." Pauline was quiet for a moment, and when Marcus glanced at her, she was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before something opened, something surprised, as though he had said precisely the right thing and she had not expected anyone to. The fence was finished by late afternoon, and Marcus and the hands rode back to Daniel's ranch in the descending cold. And that evening, Daniel's wife Ruth asked Marcus over supper how the fence building had gone, and Marcus said it had gone fine, and Ruth looked at him with the look of a woman who has been paying attention to more than the fence building, and said nothing further. But her eyes were satisfied in a way that made Marcus drink his coffee a little more quickly than usual. The trouble with Orrin Bliss came to a head in January in a manner that was unpleasant but ultimately, as Marcus had predicted, resolvable through formal channels. Pauline had written to Sheriff Alderton in the county seat in November, and Alderton had ridden out in December to look at the evidence. She had documented the fence damage, the grazing patterns, the witnesses from the neighboring Calloway family who had observed Bliss's cattle moving on Pauline's land on 2 separate occasions. Bliss had been formally warned and fined, and while he had argued loudly and at length about the injustice of it, the paper record existed now and he knew it, and the incursion stopped. Pauline came to tell Marcus directly, riding over to Daniel's ranch on a gray Wednesday morning in January with Clara in the saddle behind her, which suggested she had ridden specifically to tell him and had brought Clara along for the trip. She found him in the barn repairing a bridle, and she stood in the doorway with the cold January light behind her and told him that Alderton had resolved the situation and that his advice had been exactly right. "I'm glad," Marcus said. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said, "not just for the advice, for the fence work, for not treating me like a problem to be solved." He put the bridle down and looked at her. "You're not a problem," he said. "You're a person who had a problem. There's a difference." She held his gaze for a moment. Clara slid down from the horse behind her with complete independence and went to find Brigadier in his stall, because she had developed a particular affection for the roan gelding that was mutual, as Brigadier allowed her to feed him carrots with the patience of a horse who understood that small humans required special accommodation. "Would you come to supper?" Pauline asked. "This Sunday. You and Daniel and Ruth and Thomas, if they'd like to come. I'd like to cook a proper meal for the people who helped me." "We'd like that very much," Marcus said. The Sunday supper at Pauline's homestead was the best meal Marcus had eaten in years, venison that she had prepared with a patience and skill that turned it into something that bore no resemblance to trail food. Biscuits that Clara had helped make and was enormously proud of. A sweet potato pie that Ruth exclaimed over repeatedly, and with genuine feeling. They sat around Pauline's table in her small, well-kept house. The house she and Elias had built, and that she had maintained with the same competent attention she brought to everything. And they ate and talked and laughed, and the house was warm and the food was good and the company was easy, and Marcus thought that this was what he had been looking for without knowing its name. After supper, Daniel and Ruth and Thomas helped Clara clear the dishes into the kitchen, and there was a moment contrived perhaps by Ruth, who was canny in these matters, when Marcus and Pauline were briefly alone at the table, the last of the lamp oil burning down low, the plates cleared away and the conversation paused. "Thank you for having us," Marcus said. "Thank you for coming," Pauline said. She looked at the table and then at him. "I don't do this often," she said. "Cook for people, have them in." "I know," he said. She looked at him with that measuring quality she had, the one that assessed and considered before it concluded. "Why does it feel easy?" She said, and it was clearly a question she had not entirely intended to ask aloud, because something slightly startled moved across her face immediately after. Marcus did not answer right away. He gave the question the respect of actual thought. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I notice it too." Pauline looked down at her hands on the table. They were capable hands, work-roughened and steady, and she seemed to be looking at them as though she had not quite decided what they should do. "I have not been easy company," she said. "In 2 years, I don't think I have been easy at all." "You've been what you needed to be," Marcus said. "There's nothing wrong in that." She looked up at him and the opened quality was back on her face, the window in the dark room again. "You say things that make sense," she said. "Most people say things that are kind but don't quite make sense. You say things that make sense." "I try to," he said. "It seems like the minimum." She laughed that full, startling laugh, the one that transformed her face, and the others came back from the kitchen in that moment, and nothing more was said between them directly, but something had shifted irrevocably, and Marcus felt it shift, and from the way she glanced at him once before engaging Ruth in conversation about the sweet potato pie, he understood that she felt it too. February in West Texas was cold and gray and relentless, and the work on Daniel's ranch pulled Marcus through the days with the useful tyranny of physical necessity. But his thoughts moved toward Pauline's homestead with the regularity of something that has found its direction and can no longer be argued out of it. He rode out once a week on some pretext or another. to check the eastern fence, to drop off a tool he had borrowed, to ask about a cattle grazing question that he could genuinely have asked Daniel, but chose to ask her because she knew her own land better than anyone. And she always received him with the quiet, undemonstrative welcome of a woman who is glad someone has come, but has not yet given herself full permission to show it. Clara, who had no such restrictions on herself, was always straightforwardly delighted to see him, and had begun calling him Marcus without the Mr., which he found deeply pleasing. She had started telling him, in the detailed episodic manner of 9-year-olds recounting things that mattered to them, about her school lessons and her opinions about various classmates, and the particular goat on the property that she had named Jefferson Davis, which she had chosen based on purely phonetic grounds, having no idea who Jefferson Davis was, a situation that Pauline found both hilarious and mildly mortifying. There was an afternoon in late February when Marcus arrived to find Pauline sitting on the porch steps in the cold, not doing anything, just sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, and an expression on her face that he recognized, because he had felt it himself in the years after he had lost a partner in the New Mexico territory, a deputy who had been his friend, and who had died in a way that Marcus had partially blamed himself for. It was not sadness exactly, or not only sadness. It was the look of someone occupying their grief the way you occupy a country in winter, present in it, enduring it, waiting for a season that seems theoretical. He tied Brigadier to the fence post, and instead of announcing his errand or asking what was wrong, he simply walked to the porch and sat down on the step beside her, not close enough to intrude, just beside her, present in the space she was in. She looked at him, surprised. He met her eyes and then looked out at the same middle distance she had been looking at, the way you do when you are keeping someone company rather than interrogating their inner weather. They sat for perhaps 5 minutes without speaking. The wind moved across the open ground, and the dry grass bent and returned, and the horses moved in the pasture in the unhurried way of horses that have nowhere to be. "It was 2 years ago yesterday," Pauline said at last. "That Elias died." "I know," Marcus said quietly. She turned to look at him. "You knew. Daniel told me the date once. I remembered." She was quiet again. The wind came and went. Then she said, "People come around on it sometimes, to check on me. It's kind. But they always come with the intention of making me feel better, and sometimes you don't want to be made to feel better. Sometimes you just want to sit in it." "Yes," Marcus said. "You're not trying to make me feel better," she said. "No," he agreed. "I'm just sitting with you." She looked at him for a long time with an expression that was completely unguarded for the first time since he had known her, without the steadiness, without the careful, measured presentation, without the armor she wore so competently that most people never noticed it was armor at all. Her eyes were wet, but she did not cry. She just looked at him with everything open and raw and real, and he held her gaze steadily, not looking away, because looking away would have meant leaving her there alone, and he had no intention of doing that. "He would have liked you," she said at last. "I hope so," Marcus said. He clearly was a man worth being liked by. Something broke open in her expression then, not painfully, but the way ground breaks open in spring when it thaws, when something that has been sealed under pressure for a long time finally releases. She did not cry. She just breathed, slowly and carefully, and when she exhaled, the tension in her shoulders came down a degree, and she looked out at the pasture, and Marcus kept sitting beside her, and they stayed there together as the cold February afternoon moved around them. Clara came out eventually, bundled in her coat, and found them there on the porch steps and climbed between them with the natural self-installation of a child who sees two people she loves in proximity and considers it an obvious invitation. She brought a book, The McGuffey's Reader, on permanent loan from the Calloway family now, and said, "Will you read to me?" To both of them simultaneously, and Pauline smiled, and Marcus took the book because it seemed right, and he read 3 passages aloud while Clara leaned against her mother, and the February light went amber and low, and the cold deepened, and the day wound down around the three of them like something complete. March came with warmth that returned in tentative fits and starts, pulling back and retreating like something that had been burned before and was learning to be cautious. The land began to change, the grass greening at its roots, the early wildflowers starting along the draws, the sky moving from winter gray to a blue that had depth and warmth behind it. Marcus began to understand in March that what he felt for Pauline was not the ordinary feeling of a man who has noticed an attractive woman and been caught by the usual attractions. It was deeper and more specific than that, more tied to particular things that were particular to her. The way she analyzed a problem, the precision of her language, the quality of her silence, the unexpected force of her laughter, the love she carried for her daughter that was so total it had changed the entire shape of her life. He loved all of these things not as a collection of appealing features but as the expression of a single person, a whole and specific and irreducible human being, and that was the difference between attraction and the thing he had been trying to avoid naming. He said none of this. March was not the time. He continued to ride over once a week, sometimes more when there was honest reason for it. Daniel watched all of this with the quiet satisfaction of a man who likes his schemes to work out and considers it good sense not to comment on them. Ruth was less restrained and told Marcus over breakfast one morning that he was the most patient man she had ever known, which he took as neither complaint nor pure compliment, but as observation. It was in April, on an evening when the whole of the Texas plain was covered in the first real wildflowers of the year, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush in great sweeping drifts of color across the ground, that Marcus rode out to the homestead with no invented errand, for the first time. Just himself and Brigadier and the intention of simply being there, of seeing Pauline and talking to her, and not pretending to have another reason. She was hanging washing on the line behind the house when he arrived, and she looked up at the sound of hoofbeats with the measuring expression, and when she saw it was him, something in that expression warmed. "What brings you out?" she asked. He dismounted and tied Brigadier and walked across the yard to where she stood with a wet shirt in her hands and the April sky immense and blue behind her. "Nothing in particular," he said. "I wanted to see you." She was still for a moment, holding the wet shirt. "All right," she said. He took the other end of the shirt and helped her pin it to the line, and she let him, and they finished the washing together, a domestic, ordinary task. And then they sat on the porch with the afternoon light making the wildflowers blaze in the field beyond the fence, and they talked. They talked the way they had been building toward talking for 6 months, openly, without carefulness, about real things. He told her about New Mexico and the deputy who had died, and the years he had spent carrying the guilt of it before someone wiser than him had pointed out that the guilt was not serving either the dead or the living. She told him about Missouri, and how she had come west and what she had expected, and what the West had turned out to actually be, which was harder and stranger and more beautiful than she had imagined. She told him about Elias properly, with the fullness of it, the good years and the difficult ones, and the specific grief of losing someone when the life you had built together was only partway finished, when there were still so many things you had intended to do together that would now remain forever in the category of plans rather than memories. Marcus listened to all of it. He did not try to fix it or soften it. He let her tell it at its actual size, which was very large, and when she was done he said, "Thank you for trusting me with that." She looked at him with that fully open expression. The flowers moved in the field. Clara's voice came from somewhere inside the house, the sound of a child entertaining herself with complete self-sufficiency. "You are very different from what I expected," Pauline said. "When you first arrived, I thought you would be like most of the men who come through here." "What kind of men are those?" Marcus asked. "The kind who see a widow alone on 60 acres and begin calculating," she said. "Either what they can take or what they can offer that she ought to be grateful for." "And I'm not like that," he said. "No," she said. You're not, you just come and sit down, you don't offer solutions, you don't calculate. You just come and sit down in whatever is happening and you stay there. He looked at her. I'm here because of you, he said, not because of 60 acres. The directness of it made her look away for a moment, out at the wildflowers and the distance. When she looked back, her eyes were bright. I know, she said. I've known for a while. And, he said. She looked at him with something that was equal parts fear and courage, the particular combination that produces honesty. And I don't know what I am yet, she said. Or who. I've been only one thing for 2 years, a widow, a mother, a woman who is managing. I haven't been anything else. I'm not asking you to be anything else yet, Marcus said. I'm just asking if you'll let me keep coming. I will, she said. I want you to. It was not a declaration. Neither of them pretended it was more than what it was, which was a door being opened, and both of them had enough sense and enough scar tissue to walk through doorways slowly and with their eyes clear. But something had been said, and it could not be unsaid, and neither of them wanted it to be. May brought a warmth that was genuine and decided, and with it a kind of loosening in Pauline that Marcus noticed as much in the small things as in the large ones. She laughed more. She reached out and touched his arm when she was making a point in conversation, just briefly, the casual physical language of comfort. She sent Clara to him with a pie on a Tuesday for no reason other than that she had made too much and wanted him to have some, and the message from Clara was delivered with tremendous pride at having been trusted with the errand. They went riding together on a Sunday afternoon, Pauline on her bay mare and Marcus on Brigadier, with Clara on the small pony she called Juniper, and they rode out to where the land rose slightly to a low ridge that gave a view across miles of the Texas plain in every direction, and they stopped there and looked out at the country in the warm afternoon light. The sky was enormous, and the grass was tall and green from the spring rains, and the whole world seemed very large and very old and very steady beneath them. I love this land, Pauline said, not to either of them specifically, just to the air, the way you sometimes make a statement that is not meant to invite response but is simply too true to keep inside. It's worth loving, Marcus said. She looked at him, and he was looking at the same horizon she had been looking at, and she looked at his profile against that wide sky, the set of his jaw, the silver at his temple, the easy way he sat a horse as though he had been born to it, which in a manner of speaking he had, and she felt something move in her chest that she had not felt in 2 years, something new and tentative and frightening and entirely real. Clara, oblivious to everything but the wind and the view, said, "You can see forever from here," which was the most accurate thing any of them said that afternoon. June was when things changed. It happened simply, the way the most important things usually do. Marcus had come over on a Friday evening when the summer heat was still an hour away from lifting, and they sat on the porch after supper with Clara asleep inside, and the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky overhead in the way they do in clear-skied Texas summer. Suddenly, all at once, as though someone had scattered them. They had been talking about the cattle market, which had been unsteady, and about the new schoolteacher who was reportedly coming to Cutter's Creek in September, and then about nothing in particular, and then into a comfortable quiet. And Marcus had been watching the stars appear and thinking about how strange it was that sitting in an ordinary porch chair on an ordinary summer evening in Texas could contain something this large inside it. This feeling of being exactly where he was meant to be in a way that he had not felt in his entire adult life. And he decided to be honest about it, because he was 36 years old, and the years had taught him that honesty said at the right moment costs less than silence said at the wrong one. "Pauline," he said. She looked at him. "I love you," he said, plainly without decoration, because she was a woman who valued precision and the plain saying of true things. "I have for a while. I'm not telling you because I expect anything from it. I'm telling you because it's true, and it seems wrong to keep sitting here knowing it and not saying it." She was quiet for a long time. The stars appeared and appeared. A night bird called somewhere in the dark. "I know," she said eventually, in a voice that was low and even and held something careful in it. "You don't have to," he started. "I love you too," she said. He stopped. "I've been trying not to," she said, and there was something almost angry in it, the frustration of a person who has fought something and lost. "I've been trying to be sensible about it. I've been telling myself that I don't know if I am ready, that I don't know what it means, that there's Clara to consider, that I have enough to manage already." She paused. "But I've been in love with you since February, I think, when you sat down beside me on those steps and didn't say a single useful thing, and it was the most useful thing anyone has done for me in 2 years." Marcus looked at her. In the starlight, her face was serious and open and entirely beautiful to him, not in the way of a thing being admired, but in the way of something being recognized, something that is yours in the deepest sense of that word. "Clara," he said. "What about Clara?" Pauline's expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile but was close. "Clara told me last month that you were the best man she knew except for her father, and that they were different kinds of best, so it was all right to have both," she said. "She's 9 years old and she has more wisdom than half the adults in this county." Marcus exhaled, and what came out with the breath was a weight he had not entirely been aware he was carrying. "She's remarkable," he said, for the 10th or 100th time. "She is," Pauline agreed. He reached across the space between their chairs and put his hand over hers, where it rested on the arm of her chair, and she turned her hand over and held his. And they sat like that in the Texas summer dark, with the stars multiplying overhead and the nightbird calling, and the cattle moving soft and distant in the pasture. And it was the first real peace Marcus had known in a decade, and the first that Pauline had known in 2 years. And neither of them spoke for a long time, because nothing that needed saying had been left unsaid. The summer of 1880, one moved through Cutter's Creek with the brilliant, unhurried certainty of all Texas summers, long days and spectacular evening storms, and the smell of rain on hot earth, and the cicadas in full summer voice, and the sunflowers turning their faces along the fence lines. Marcus and Pauline did not rush anything. They did not need to. They were both people who had learned the cost of hurrying through the things that mattered, and what they were building between them was built slowly and well, the way all lasting things are built. He came for supper on Fridays, regularly now, without pretense. He brought Clara a set of proper colored pencils from the supply store in the county seat, which she received with a reverence bordering on the religious. He and Pauline rode out together on Sundays after church when the weather allowed, and on the Sundays when it did not they sat on her porch or at her table and talked and read, and were simply together in the easy, satisfying way of two people who have found in each other the particular company they had been missing. He kissed her for the first time on a July evening when a thunderstorm had come up fast from the south, and they had stood on the porch watching it advance across the plain, the lightning moving in great branching forks across the sky, the smell of it electric and ancient. And she had been talking about something, some observation about the way the storm moved, and he had been watching her face instead of the storm, and she had stopped mid-sentence and looked at him, and he had kissed her, and she had kissed him back. And the storm had broken over them in a wave of wind and rain, and it was the most purely cinematic and alive moment Marcus had experienced in his entire life. He asked her to marry him in September, on the same low ridge where they had ridden in May, with Clara present, because it seemed to him that asking Pauline was inseparable from asking Clara, that the two of them were a single unit, and any life he asked Pauline into was a life that included her daughter fully and equally. He had thought about how to do it for weeks, and in the end he had not found elaborate strategy particularly useful, and had decided to simply do it the way he did most things, plainly and honestly, in a place that mattered. They rode up to the ridge on a clear September morning when the air was just beginning to carry autumn's crispness at its edges, and the land below them was golden and enormous. He dismounted and helped Clara down from Juniper, and then he stood and looked at both of them, this woman and this child who had completely reorganized the meaning of his life. And he said, "I want to ask you both something." Clara looked at him with the bright, unsuspecting interest of a child who does not know what is coming. Pauline looked at him with the look of a woman who might have an idea. "Pauline," he said, "I love you. I have loved you since before I admitted it, and I will love you for the rest of my life. I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you on that homestead, and I want to work beside you and wake up beside you and grow old with you in this country that you love." He looked at Clara. "And I want to be here for you," he said to her. "Not to take your father's place, because no one could, and that is not what I am trying to do. Just to be here, to be someone who is on your side." Clara's eyes had gone very round. She processed this with the serious thoroughness she brought to all significant information. Then she said, "If you marry Mama, does that mean you'll be my father?" "I'll be whatever you need me to be," Marcus said. "Whatever word fits." Clara thought about this for a moment of absolute solemnity. Then she said, "I would like it if you were my father," in a voice that was small and certain. Marcus had to look away for a moment at the wide Texas sky because something had come up in his chest that made speaking temporarily difficult. When he looked back, Pauline was watching him with eyes that were very bright. "Yes," she said. She had not said it in response to a question yet, and they both knew it. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said again. "I'll marry you, Marcus Hadley." He took both her hands in his, and they stood there on the ridge with Clara watching, and the whole of West Texas spread below them, and the sky went on and on above them without limit. They were married in November, in the church on the east end of Main Street in Cutter's Creek, on a clear, cold day when the light was the color of pale gold, and came in sideways through the church windows and lay across everything in long, warm bars. The church was full. The community had opinions about Pauline Shepard and the 2 years she had endured, and about Marcus Hadley, who had sat down beside her in it, and those opinions were almost uniformly warm, so the pews filled up. Ruth had cried at breakfast that morning and claimed it was the cold air, which no one believed. Daniel wore his good coat and shook Marcus's hand 3 times before they arrived at the church, which was 2 times more than was strictly necessary, but Marcus did not mind. Thomas was solemn and pleased in equal measure, as was his way. Clara wore a dress that Ruth had sewn for her from a blue fabric that matched the Texas sky, and she walked down the aisle before her mother with a small bouquet of late autumn flowers, and a composure that was so complete it seemed almost supernatural in a 10-year-old. Pauline wore the color of cream, not white, a practical woman's acknowledgement of reality, and she walked down the aisle herself, because she had decided that she was walking into this marriage as herself, whole and complete, and arrived under her own power. She was the most beautiful thing Marcus had ever seen in his life, and he was fairly certain this was visible on his face and did not attempt to conceal it. The vows they exchanged were the traditional ones, spoken by the minister of the church with the gravity they deserved, and Marcus and Pauline spoke them back with the full weight of 2 people who understood what they were saying, because they had each already lived through the territory where promises meet reality and are tested to their limit. At the end, when the minister said what needed to be said and Marcus kissed his wife, a word that felt solid and true and new all at once, Clara, standing beside her mother, grabbed Marcus's hand on one side and Pauline's on the other and held them both at once, and the congregation, which had been mostly behaving with appropriate dignity, made a collective sound of pure, undisguised feeling. They had a supper that evening at Daniel's ranch, which had more space, and Ruth and the women of Cutter's Creek had produced quantities of food that suggested they had been planning and cooking for some time, because there was simply no world in which so much could have been accomplished in a single day. There were long tables set up in the barn, which had been swept and decorated with autumn leaves and lanterns, and there was fiddle music and the particular warmth of a community gathered in genuine celebration. And Marcus danced with his wife, and then danced with Clara, who had very specific opinions about the correct way to move in a reel, and communicated them with the helpful directness of a child who considers honest feedback a form of kindness. He moved into the homestead. This was the practical reality, and they had agreed on it easily. The homestead was Pauline's land and Clara's home, and the thing she had held together for 2 years, and Marcus had no desire to displace any of it. He came with Brigadier and his leather bag and an additional trunk of tools, and clothing that he had accumulated at Daniel's, and he put his things into the house that Pauline Shepard had built, and he was careful about this. He was careful to be a presence in the house rather than a replacement, to add himself to the shape of what was already there rather than trying to reshape it around himself. He hung his coat on the peg beside the door, and he found a place for his boots, and he did not move anything that was already in its place without asking first. Pauline watched all of this. She watched the care of it, and one evening about a week after the wedding, when they were sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp burning between them and Clara asleep down the hall, she said, "You don't have to be that careful, you know." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "You move through this house like you're afraid of taking up too much room," she said. "You don't have to be afraid of that. This is your home now." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm aware that this house has a history," he said. "That you and Elias built it." "Yes," she said, "and now we live in it together. Both of those things are true. The history doesn't disappear, but it doesn't require you to make yourself smaller." She reached across the table and put her hand on his arm. "I want you to be here, Marcus, fully here, not apologizing for being here." He looked at her hand on his arm and then at her face, and something in him settled, a final reservation or hesitation releasing. "All right," he said. "Good," she said, and squeezed his arm, and that was the end of it. The winter of 1881 into 1882 was the first winter they spent as a family, and it was the kind of winter that is beautiful and brutal in turn, the way West Texas winters tend to be: clear, brilliant days of cold, sharp light, alternating with storms that came off the plains with tremendous force and deposited snow across everything in drifts that required hours of work to manage. Marcus worked the cattle and the fences in the cold with the same steady, uncomplaining competence he brought to everything, and Pauline worked beside him with the same. And by the end of each day, they were tired in the satisfying way of people who have done real work together, and they ate supper at the table with Clara between them and the lamp burning, and the fire in the stove ticking against the cold. And it was the life Marcus had been looking for without knowing its name, and it was the life Pauline had been afraid she might not have again, and they were both grateful for it in a way that was too large for frequent expression, but was present in everything, in the way they moved around each other in the kitchen, in the way he looked at her when she was not watching him, in the way she always reached for his hand when they walked anywhere together, which he found completely astonishing and wonderful every single time. Clara, for her part, had settled into the new arrangement with the thorough and practical intelligence she brought to all significant life changes. She called Marcus by his given name, as she always had, though she had told Ruth privately, who had told Daniel, who had told Marcus with a great deal of careful nonchalance, that she thought of him as her father, and that this was the best word for what he was, even if it was not the word she used. Marcus kept this information in his chest like something he wanted to protect from weather, and did not mention it to Clara, because some things are better understood than spoken. The new schoolhouse was completed in the spring of 1882, and Clara went to it with great enthusiasm and became the particular kind of student who exhausts teachers with questions, which the new school teacher, a young woman named Miss Abernathy from Tennessee, handled with admirable patience and eventually grew to appreciate. In the spring of 1882, Pauline discovered she was carrying their child, and she told Marcus on an April evening when the wildflowers had come back to cover the field beyond the fence again, bluebonnets and paintbrush, the same flowers that had been there the spring before, a natural rhythm that suggested the world was interested in continuity. She told him simply and directly, in the manner she told him everything, And Marcus looked at her for a moment with an expression that went through several things at once: joy and astonishment, and the particular tenderness of a man who has not expected this particular happiness, and is therefore affected by it more completely than if he had. And then he put his arms around her and held her close, and she leaned her face against his chest. And they stood like that in the April evening, with the flowers around them and the land extending in every direction, quiet and unhurried. "Are you all right?" he asked, because she had been through this before and he did not want to assume. "I am very all right," she said against his chest. "I am better than all right." He pressed his mouth to the top of her head and stayed there for a moment. "Good," he said, and meant it with his entire self. Clara, when informed, took this news with an initial moment of extremely serious processing, during which she appeared to be running extensive internal calculations. And then she said, "I would like a brother," which she delivered as a preference rather than a demand, the way she had decided that being diplomatic about important matters was a grown-up quality worth cultivating. Then she added, "But if it is a sister, she will have to learn to ride properly," which was her way of saying she would accept the outcome either way as long as the new person met minimum equestrian standards. The pregnancy was unremarkable in the best possible sense of that word. Pauline was healthy and practical about it, continuing to work and ride with modifications as the months progressed. The summer passed in this way, the homestead busy and warm, and full of the overlapping labor and conversation and laughter of a family that was figuring out its shape. Marcus repaired the barn roof in June and extended the kitchen garden in July, because Pauline had been wanting more space for growing vegetables, and there was no reason not to give it to her. They built a chicken coop together in August, which involved a creative disagreement about the optimal placement of the door that they resolved by compromising, and then discovering that Pauline's original position had been correct, which she noted without crowing over, and which Marcus acknowledged with the good humor of a man who finds his wife being right more pleasing than unsettling. Daniel and Ruth rode over frequently throughout the summer, and the two families had grown into the kind of neighborly closeness that the West Texas landscape seemed to foster. The understanding that the land was large, and the people on it few enough that proximity had to mean something more than mere geography. Thomas was 13 now and working alongside his father with the serious application of a boy becoming a man, and Clara and Thomas had a complicated friendship based primarily on mutual intellectual challenge and competitive arguments about everything from cattle breeds to the trajectory of history, which both families found entertaining. The child was born in November of 1882, a boy, arriving in the clear cold of a November morning, with the light coming in through the bedroom window and those same long pale bars that had been there on the wedding day. He was born healthy and considerable and unhappy about the transition, which he expressed loudly, and at length until Pauline held him, at which point he subsided into the complete peace of a creature who has found where it is meant to be. They named him Thomas Elias Hadley Thomas for Daniel's son, who had been a source of steadiness and company for Clara through the years of difficulty, and Elias for Pauline's first husband, because Marcus had suggested it himself, had brought it up on a quiet evening months before as they discussed names, and had said that honoring Elias seemed right, and that he was not threatened by the honoring of a good man's memory. Pauline had loved him for that with a fresh, specific force that she expressed by pressing her face against the side of his neck and staying there for a long time without speaking. Clara named the boy Tom the day he arrived and refused to call him anything else, which turned out to be what everyone called him thereafter. Marcus held his son on the first morning of Tom's life, sitting in the chair beside the bed where Pauline rested, and he looked at this small face, red and enormous-eyed, and utterly new, with a feeling that was beyond his vocabulary to precisely contain. He had been a man who had, for many years, moved through the world with the assumption that this particular kind of life was not available to him, that he had missed something irrevocably in the years of drifting and working and losing people and being lost himself. And here was the refutation of that assumption, physical and undeniable, 8 pounds of absolute counterargument in his arms. Pauline was watching him from the bed. She was exhausted and beautiful, her hair loose and her face soft with the openness that exhaustion sometimes grants. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He looked up from the baby to his wife. "I'm thinking about how much of my life was just finding my way here," he said, "without knowing that was what I was doing." She smiled, the full smile, the window and the dark room open all the way. "We were both finding our way here," she said, "through different roads. Longer ones than they needed to be," he said. "Maybe," she said. "Or exactly the right length. I can't tell from here." He looked back down at Tom, who had gone to sleep with the total commitment of new infants, and then back at Pauline. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For letting me in," he said. "For that first night on the porch steps when you let me sit there. For all the rest of it. For this." Pauline's eyes filled, and she let them, which she rarely did, let the feeling come all the way to the surface and show itself plainly. "Thank you for sitting down," she said. "You were the first person who did." That winter, the second winter in the homestead, was the warmest Marcus had known in 20 years, and also the warmest of his life in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. The house was full in the way that only a house with a new baby is full, with the specific particular presence of a new person, with the routine of feeding and sleeping, and the learning of a small face's expressions, with Clara bending over the cradle with the careful reverence of a child who has understood that she is responsible for someone. Clara turned 11 in December and received, from Marcus, a proper set of watercolor paints that she had mentioned wanting once in the previous spring, and that he had remembered with the attentiveness that characterized everything he did for the people he loved. Tom grew, as babies do, quickly, and with the stubborn vigor of someone who has decided that existing is an excellent project and intends to pursue it energetically. He had Pauline's eyes, which were brown and clear and direct, and Marcus's coloring, which was dark. He had an early and particular attachment to Brigadier, which manifested before he could properly walk in a tendency to make his way toward the horse whenever he could, and which Brigadier accommodated with the patient dignity of an animal who understood that small humans had a claim on his time. The spring of 1883 brought the wildflowers back, and it brought also the resolution of the final loose piece of difficulty that had been sitting in the background of Cutter's Creek's community life for years, which was the matter of fair water rights on the Western Creek, that had been an ongoing source of argument between several families, including Pauline's homestead and the Bliss operation. The creek ran through a property to the west, and Bliss had for years attempted to control its access, which was technically and legally not within his rights, but which he pursued with the persistent opportunism that had characterized his approach to the land since before Pauline's husband had died. Marcus, with the help of the county commissioner and the documentation that had been accumulated over the course of several years, pursued a formal resolution through the county seat, and by May of that year, the creek access had been legally clarified and established in terms that were fair to all the homestead families along its course. This was the last of the practical difficulties. The land was settled. The life was settled. The family was settled. In the summer of 1883, Marcus and Daniel expanded the working relationship between their two operations, running cattle together in a loose partnership that made practical sense given the shared resources and mutual trust that had built up between the two families over the years. Daniel's ranch and Pauline's homestead were not merged. They remained distinct operations with distinct ownership. But they worked together in the way of people who trust each other completely, which made both operations stronger. Clara, who was 11 going on 35, had declared by this point that she intended to run her mother's homestead one day, which Pauline received with the pride that comes from having passed something important to the next person who can carry it. She was already demonstrating a practical aptitude for cattle and land management that exceeded what most adults in the county could claim, and Marcus taught her everything he knew with the focused investment of a parent who can see what a child is capable of and considers it a privilege to help them reach it. There were ordinary things and there were extraordinary things, and this was the gift of the life they had, that the ordinary things were rich enough that the extraordinary things did not need to be dramatic to feel enormous. The evenings on the porch as the Texas sun went down. The mornings when the coffee was ready, and the light was coming in through the kitchen window and Marcus was already outside, and Pauline would watch him from there. This man who had arrived from New Mexico with a roan horse and a leather bag and had sat down beside her in the hardest place of her life, and had not moved, and feel the particular gratitude of someone who knows the value of what they have because they know what its absence was like. She told him this on a September evening in 1883, when Tom was nearly a year old and Clara was at Ruth and Daniel's for the weekend, and the homestead was quiet in the early autumn way, the flowers from the summer drying on the fence posts and the light going gold and low. They were on the porch, as they often were, with Tom sleeping inside, and the evening was the color of old copper and warm metal. "I want to tell you something," Pauline said. "Tell me," Marcus said. "I was so afraid," she said. "For so long, not of being alone, I could manage being alone, but of never again having someone who saw me properly, who knew what I was actually made of and wanted to be here for it, not despite it." She looked at her hands and then at him. "You see me," she said. "You always have, from the beginning, and it changed everything." Marcus looked at his wife in the autumn light, this woman who had carried so much so quietly and had finally put some of it down, and he reached over and took her hand the way he had that first night on the porch when the stars were coming out, and she laced her fingers through his, and they sat in the descending evening with the land all around them. The land she loved, the land he had come to love because she loved it, and because loving what she loved was simply part of what he was now. "You saw me too," he said, "that day in the general store with the lamp oil, a woman who knew her own mind. I thought, that is someone worth knowing." He paused. "I had no idea how right I was." She laughed, the full laugh, startling and warm, and Tom stirred briefly inside and then settled. And somewhere on the property, a horse moved in the pasture, and the evening birds began their calls, and the first star appeared in the deepening blue of the sky overhead, and the life they had built surrounded them completely, solid and warm and real and fully, entirely theirs. 2 years after Tom's birth, in the autumn of 1884, Pauline discovered she was expecting again. She told Marcus in the kitchen on a weekday morning when Clara had already left for school, and Tom was sitting on the floor with a series of wooden spoons that he was deploying as an army, and Marcus was pouring his second cup of coffee, and she said simply, "I think we're going to have another child." And Marcus set his coffee cup down on the counter with slightly more force than he intended, not from anything bad but from the sheer, sudden, unguarded shock of joy. "Are you sure?" he said. "I am sure," she said. He crossed the kitchen to her and took her face in his hands and kissed her. And Tom, observing this from the floor with the wooden spoon army, said "Mama" and "Dada" in rapid succession, which were the only relevant words he had and which he deployed with confident authority. The second child was a girl, born in the early summer of 1885, when the Texas heat was already settling in with its long, ambitious warmth, and the wildflowers were fully out, and the days were enormous and golden. She was born on a Thursday morning, and she arrived with less complaint than her brother had, as though she had considered the matter of existence more calmly in advance and decided it suited her. They named her Eliza Ruth, Eliza for the old world, the soft end of a vowel, and Ruth for Daniel's wife, who had been the nearest thing to a sister Pauline had known since coming west. Ruth, upon hearing this, cried immediately and without apology, and Daniel brought her a handkerchief and the expression of a man who is proud of his wife and pleased that this is the kind of thing that happens in his life. Clara, who was 14 by this point, and had achieved a height and a composure that made her look 3 years older, received her sister with the particular combination of delight and authority that characterizes teenage girls when presented with babies. She held Eliza with complete confidence from the first day, and appointed herself educational director of the new Hadley child's life, which everyone found reasonable given her track record with Tom, who at nearly 3 was already in possession of considerably more practical knowledge than any child his age needed, and who could name every horse in the county, and had opinions about grass quality. The homestead by 1885 was a different place than it had been when Pauline Shepard died in 1878. Not unrecognizably so, but grown, extended, worked deeper into productivity and organization by two people who both knew what they were doing, and who had combined their knowledge and their effort into something larger than either alone. There was a proper vegetable garden now, expanded further than the summer of 1882, and new fencing along the south boundary that was better built than the original, and a second barn that had gone up in 1883 to accommodate the expanded operation. The house itself was the same house, but it had been added to a room off the back for Clara, because a 14-year-old deserved her own space, and the enlargement of the kitchen by a careful expansion that Marcus had designed and built over the course of the previous autumn in the evenings after the main work of the day. It was Pauline Shepard's homestead, and it was Pauline Hadley's homestead, and it was Marcus Hadley's home, and all of those things were simultaneously true, and everyone who mattered understood the truth of each. In September of 1885, Clara turned 15 and received from her mother and Marcus 2 things: a proper side saddle of excellent quality that she had needed for years, and the formal transfer of a small section of the eastern pasture into her name, which Marcus had arranged with the county land office, and which Pauline had signed with the solemn pride of a mother who is watching her child begin to be ready for the world. Clara held the deed and looked at it, and then looked at Marcus and said, in the voice of a person who does not have easy access to the depths of what she feels, "Thank you," and Marcus said, "It was always going to be yours," which was true. On a Sunday afternoon in October of 1885, the whole extended family gathered on the ridge, the low rise above the plain that had been the site of a marriage proposal 4 years before. Marcus and Pauline rode up with Tom between them on a small new pony, and Clara rode ahead with the independent elegance she had developed on horseback, and Daniel and Ruth and Thomas came from the east road, and they all gathered on the height with the autumn Texas plain spread beneath them in every direction, the grass golden, and the sky that particular shade of clean blue that only comes in October. Tom, who was 3 and narrated his experience of the world in a running commentary that everyone found both exhausting and wonderful, said, "Far," pointing at the horizon. "Very far." "Very far," Marcus agreed, lifting him to sit on the saddle in front of him, where Tom grabbed Brigadier's mane with proprietary confidence. Pauline rode beside Marcus, close enough that their horses' shoulders nearly touched. She looked at the horizon and then at her family and then at this man beside her, this man who had come from New Mexico with a roan horse and a leather bag and had sat down on her porch steps on a cold February afternoon and had not tried to fix anything, had just been there, and it had been the beginning of everything. "Marcus," she said. He looked at her. The October light was on her face, warm and angled, catching the few strands of silver that had appeared at her temples in the years since Tom's birth, which she wore without vanity because she wore everything without vanity, because she had never needed appearance to tell her who she was. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She considered this for a moment with the precision she brought to everything. "I am thinking," she said, "that I have everything I did not know how to want anymore 2 years after Elias died. I am thinking that I was so careful not to want it that I almost missed it." "But you didn't," he said. "But I didn't," she agreed, "because you sat down." He reached across and put his hand over hers where it rested on her saddle horn, and she turned her palm up and held his hand. And Tom said something unintelligible but happy about Brigadier, and Clara called something back to them about the view, and Daniel laughed at something Ruth had said, and Thomas pointed out a hawk riding the thermals above the plain below, and all of it, all of the ordinary, extraordinary, specific, irreplaceable texture of this one life, was present and real and whole. The sun moved across the October sky above West Texas, and the shadow of the ridge lengthened slowly across the golden plain below. And the people on the ridge moved in the way that people on a Sunday afternoon move when there is nothing urgent and nowhere required. And the company is exactly right, unhurried and complete, present in the moment the way that only contentment allows, the kind that has been arrived at rather than fallen into, earned through difficulty and loss, and the courage of beginning again. Brigadier tossed his head at something, and Tom laughed, and Marcus steadied the horse with one hand and kept Pauline's hand in the other, and looked out at the enormous country that had become his country, at the life that had become his life, at the woman beside him who had let him in through the hardest door she had, and he thought that there was nothing left unfinished, nothing left unresolved, nothing left unsaid that needed saying. There was only this: the land, the family, the woman, the life. The beginning of things was long behind them, and the future was long ahead, and the present was exactly right. The wind came over the ridge from the south, warm and carrying the smell of grass and distance, and they rode down from the height together as the afternoon moved toward evening and went home.